Welcome to Fade to PB8. In this episode, we'll be coloring in this image of a vampire lady in a purple setting. And what I'll do is I'll voice over, I'll speed it up 16 times, voice over, and talk through some of my color strategies, some of my approaches, and how I achieved my final result. Hope you enjoy. Thank you. Now, the first thing I want you to notice is that I have selected my palette ahead of time. I've thought about my markers for pretty much every aspect of the drawing. There's a few reasons that I do this. Number one, it takes time to find your markers. And once the ink hits the paper, it starts to dry. And generally, we like to work with wet paper because it's just easier to blend, it's easier to correct mistakes. So it's good to have those markers out ahead of time in case you have a large collection, because it can just take time to find them. The second reason why is I like to compare the colors together, make sure things fit in. I can compare the colors of the bats compared to the sky well before they ever hit the actual paper. And the third reason is that I like to use different markers for different sections. I really don't like to reuse the same marker. However, in this drawing, we kind of make an exception where we do a lot of highlights with purple. Pretty much everything is going to get these purple highlights. I wanted it to be a very purple drawing, so to speak. So you'll notice that for the sky, I have 3 purples and 3 grays out there, but I actually only use the purples. And the reason why I grab the grays is that it gives me the option to go darker. But I decided to just use the purples at first, then work on the clouds, and then if I needed to go back and make the clouds darker, I could add in those grays. Make the sky darker, I could add in those grays. Now, for the clouds, I went over everything with a very light gray marker, and I kind of saturated the paper. I probably went over it twice before I started adding in these violet highlights, purple highlights. And the reason why I do that is because I want to be able to kind of fade these purple markers together. If I hadn't put down that gray marker first, the purples would start to dry, and then it kind of leaves a line along the border of the line that you put down. So by getting the paper wet first, it increases the dry time. And these clouds, they take a little while. You have to kind of consider the surface area that you're working with, and also kind of like how much detail's in there. If it's an empty sky and it takes up half your page, it's a totally different coloring strategy compared to these clouds that take up, maybe a fifth of the page but have a lot more detail. So you always want to, the dry time of the markers is important. Basically, we generally like wet paper. When it's wet, it's just easier to correct mistakes. You can go in with a lighter marker and actually lighten things up quite a bit. Same thing with the blender marker. And then it's just easier to blend colors together. Because when the paper's wet and it starts to dry and you add more ink to to wet paper, it kind of starts to fade into the paper. It bleeds a little bit, and sometimes that's good. We want to use that to our advantage because that kind of helps us fade naturally. But again, the paper has to be wet for that to happen. Now, I like to go light to dark. Some people will go dark to light. I think going dark to light maybe uses a little bit less ink, maybe it's a little bit quicker. However, I think it's riskier because you're kind of just going for the final color right away, and you're not 100% certain that the colors are going to all go together. So I like to kind of work everything light, and then I kind of keep progressively getting a little bit darker and darker until things kind of match and they line up. So with these clouds, I'm adding in these darker colors towards the bottom of each cloud, and I'm referencing the sky. I want to make sure those clouds certainly aren't going to get darker than the sky. So I keep track of kind of what markers I use and where. You'll notice that for these little tree things in the upper corners, I start with purple, then I go brown, then I go purple, then I go brown, and I kind of keep jumping back and forth between that highlight color and the natural color of the wood. For the bats, I picked out 4 colors in my palette. I think I only ended up using 3. It's always a good idea to grab a couple extra markers just in case. Now, 3 markers is probably the magic number. You've got a light marker, a mid-tone, and then a dark marker. And those three you can work really well together to kind of fade. And you can get a lot of colors out of 3 markers. 4 markers, maybe if you have a really strong fade from a very light color to a very dark color, or if you're just kind of mixing in maybe some blues with your purples, a 4th or 5th marker isn't a bad idea. You want to be careful that when you're working in a small area that you don't oversaturate the paper. Yes, we love wet paper. However, if you put down too much ink too quickly, the ink will start to bleed through the lines. It'll spread out. It'll also bleed to the back side of the paper. It can cause warping. It's easier to damage the paper, especially if you're using the chisel tip. So we don't want to oversaturate the paper. If you find that your paper has gotten too wet, just step away for a few minutes. Maybe even use a hair dryer from a distance on a very low setting. That's something I do later, you'll see. But it helps to monitor how wet your paper is. Or maybe even just go work on a different section of the paper while that dries off. Now for these bushes, these are a very low attention point. I don't really want people looking at these bushes. I just want them to fit in. So I kind of did a combination of these green grays with some of those purple markers, those purple highlights. And it's really important to think about where the attention is drawn. You're going to show this to a friend, and they'll probably look at it for like 5-10 seconds maybe. And probably 80% of the time, they're going to be looking at the main character. Your eyes will instantly go to their face and then to their body, and then you'll probably see the clouds because they're relatively bright. But there's some parts of the drawing that they probably won't notice at all, like the bushes, maybe the dirt, those wooden trees in the upper corners. And so it's just important to note, like, how much detail do I need to put here? So you'll see that when I'm working these flowers in the front, again, I'm just kind of jumping back and forth between the green grays and the purples. And you can actually go quite a bit lighter by adding in a lighter marker as long as that ink is wet. The blender marker is great too. I just use that, and that will line things up a fair bit too. Just be careful with the blender marker. It does behave a little bit differently than normal ink. It kind of like spreads out and then gets a little darker around the edges. So if you saturate like a small area, the blender marker kind of like spreads and then it gets dark on the outside and kind of light on the inside of that spot that you just did. Now for the dirt, again, I am jumping back and forth between the browns and the purples. But I started with the lightest brown, and then I kind of worked my way a little bit darker and darker and darker. And I'm not just using one brown for the entire thing. I've got like 3 different browns of a similar tone. And I'm kind of just scattering them around the ground. I don't want things to be monotone. I want, for things to look alive, they have to have some sort of fade, some sort of gradient, a variety of colors, even if it's very, very subtle. You do not want to be flat. Any flat part of the drawing really, really, really can kind of take away from it. The only time I ever use like one marker and do go flat is if I'm working in a really small area, like maybe the iris of a pupil, for example. Or, even those candles, those flames, I used 2 markers. I used a yellow and then kind of like a goldish color. You can't really see it, but it's there. And for the candle holders, since it's relatively thin, I couldn't really fit in a 3rd marker, but I do have 2 markers there. On the inside is a highlight color, and on the outside is just my darker color. And I started with a lighter gray, knowing that I could always go a little bit darker. And I actually ended up keeping the gray that I have there. I think it works out nicely. But yeah, if I had started with a darker gray, there's just no going lighter. But I started with lighter gray, and there is going darker. Now, for the coffin that she is sitting on, the box is supposed to be a vampire on a coffin. I actually am not terribly pleased with my approach. I thought it would be kind of neat to have like a wooden top with kind of like this blue golden color on the sides. But I put it down and I just didn't really care for it. But, I think I do an okay job of correcting it because, like I said, we can always go darker. So we ended up kind of mixing in some darker blues and some darker purples, and I think I might go in with a darker brown. But it ends up becoming this very dark color. And here I'm using the hairdryer because I kind of went over it too many times. Now make sure when you use the hairdryer, you're not just sticking it at one spot. You're moving it around quite a bit. Put it on the lowest setting. And it's also a good idea to do the back side of the paper. If you do it unevenly, the paper will start to warp on you. I've kind of found that it doesn't really matter if I let it air dry or if I use a hair dryer as far as the warping goes. I find it'll kind of warp about the same either way. Just be careful with the hair dryer not to get it too hot because it is a thin piece of paper and it will heat up very, very quickly. Okay, back to the box. You can see that I'm kind of going over with these darker markers. I'm kind of correcting the mistake I didn't like. But you know what? In some things, like, you can change the colors and it's okay. Clothing is probably the best example. She could be wearing a blue dress. She could be wearing a green dress. Mix it in with purples. And, like, it could be any colored dress. It's just important that you get the shading right and that it looks three-dimensional. But the color itself doesn't matter too much, just as long as it kind of like fits the environment. And actually, one thing I probably could have done a little bit better. Once we get to the dress, I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. Probably a little bit darker. Since that box became so dark, I probably could have gone a little bit darker with her dress. But I think it turned out nicely. So what I'm doing here is I have selected, you can see my palette on the right-hand side. I've got some purples and I've got some blues, and I'm kind of going to jump back and forth between the purples and the blues and progressively get a little bit darker. So it's a light purple, then a light blue, then a medium purple, medium blue, and so on. You want to really follow the lines when you're doing clothing, and when you add your markers, when you start with the first marker, we start with the lightest one. I kind of go over everything, and I'll kind of saturate the spots that I think will be the brightest. But I kind of mix I kind of just start getting the paper wet. I start putting the ink down. It just creates a base layer that helps me blend things together a little bit easier with other markers. Again, just being careful not to oversaturate, but you can probably put down, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 layers before it starts to oversaturate. Now, I use 60-pound paper. I do find that 20-pound is a little bit too thin. I guess the one advantage of 20-pound paper is it doesn't use as much ink, but it does oversaturate pretty quickly, and it makes it a little bit harder to correct your mistakes. So with my technique, yes, I do use quite a bit more ink because I'll go over the same spot probably between 5, 10, sometimes maybe even 15 times. So that does use quite a bit of ink. But I use a low-risk strategy. By going light to dark and stepping it up, it's a low risk because I can always go darker. I can correct my mistakes a little bit easier. With each layer that I add down, the paper gets slightly more damp, making it easier to correct mistakes, make changes, go lighter. Now, what I was saying before is I take the lightest marker and I just go over everything and saturate what I think is going to be the highlight areas. But every single time I step it up to a darker marker, I always add that darker marker, to basically the part of the drawing that I think is going to be the darkest. So maybe underneath her armpit, maybe towards the rear of her bottom. You can see at the bottom of her dress, I added in the kind of dark blue, like right underneath the dress. And so I can work with that. I can always make it a little bit lighter. I can make the other parts darker. Just trying to keep things consistent, the tone and how dark it is. And then you can see here, I'm kind of going over everything with purple. I thought it was a little bit too blue. I just grab a purple marker of a similar tone and just go over everything. It's not going to change the shading very much as long as it's similar darkness. But it also, when you go over everything, you're kind of bringing things together. You kind of help fade all your different lines and it just gives you a nice look. I mean, there are many different approaches to doing it, but this is my approach, and it's worked pretty well for me. Now, what I do here is I actually set some weight on the paper and I let it dry for a bit, and that will help prevent it warping too. So now for the skin, I actually didn't like what I did here. I went in with a purple marker first and kind of hit some of the face, and then I come in with my light skin color. And you know what? It was just kind of hard to... I think the skin color was much lighter than that purple marker I added down, and so the purple marker was kind of dominating. So you'll see I kind of keep making the skin a little bit darker until it looks more skin-like and less purple-like, but I still want a touch of purple. I want everything to have a bit of purple in it. So you can see I just kind of gradually get a little bit darker in some places. Maybe this reddish marker was a little bit too much, but since the paper's wet, I can usually work it back in. You want to be careful around eyeballs, especially like a small face. It's very easy to oversaturate a small face. You just want to keep going over and over and over, and before you know it, that paper is soaking wet, and adding more color is only going to make things worse. So if you find yourself doing that, again, just step away, use the hairdryer, work on a different section, and so on. So this is an AI generated image. I use this website called Color Bliss. It's a lot of fun. I think it ranges between like $10 and $30 depending on the tier level, but it's really cool. You just type in a prompt and then it will generate an image for you. And so for this one, I think I said a vampire lady sitting on her coffin. Something simple, and then it kind of fills in the rest for you. But you gotta be careful with this AI stuff, because you know what, there are mistakes, and it might get 99 out of 100 parts of the drawing right, but that one thing that's wrong could ruin the entire thing. So if you take a look at her hair, you'll notice it looks a little bit funny, and I decided, you know what, I think I can let this one slide. So it kind of looks like she's got some hair that probably goes down to like her belly button, and then she's got some more hair that probably goes down to her knees. But you don't really notice it too much, so I just let it slide. So for the hair, it's the same general strategy, light to dark, kind of working in this pinkish color, and then I'm just kind of jumping back and forth between that pinkish color and the purples that I've been using the whole time. So pretty much everything I have gone over with the purple markers. And since everything has that purple, her skin actually ends up looking pretty normal. I think if you took her skin and cut everything else away and you put it on white paper, you wouldn't notice the purple. However, since everything around it is a much darker purple, her skin actually looks more normal, I should say. So with the hair, towards the end of the drawing, sometimes I get a little fatigued, and I think it's important to pace yourself. Just work on one section at a time, and just be patient, especially when you're waiting for ink to dry. But you know what? I'm actually very satisfied with this drawing, and I think it turned out really well. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I go in with a white gel pen to kind of brighten up the eyeballs because it bled into it. Just make sure when you use the white gel pen that the ink is dry. It'll work much better. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.